Okay, we are lucky. So it's streaming on YouTube. I starting on Zoom. We are recording.
Okay. You're monitoring comments on YouTube as well?
I can't do it in the same time, but it's live now.
Okay. Yeah, we're live.
Yeah. So welcome, Dr. Bialik or Bialik is a multidisciplinary earth scientist studying ocean and climate changes in the geological past and present. I like this word multidisciplinary. I remember one old colleague of mine, when I came as a postdoc, told me, give me one core and one proxy, and I'll tell you how the Earth works. It's not that time anymore. We're not in Kansas anymore. We need multi-proxies and many things to integrate to understand how the ocean works and how the paleoclimate has worked in the past. So, or integrates carbonate sedimentology, geochemistry, and paleoceanography to reconstruct a more integral picture of environmental change. He comes with his PhD from Israel at Ben Gurion University in the Negev, and has been a researcher in many places, many interesting places, and he's now a scientist at the University of Haifa and University of Münster. And he's here today to talk about the onset of the monsoon and how that relates to Miocene paleoproductivity patterns in the Arabian Sea. And I'm very happy to be able to listen to this talk. I'm interested in the same subject. It's a very interesting part of the world. So welcome, War. Let's hope that this presentation will run okay on YouTube. And let's go.
Thanks, Livia. So everybody hopefully can see my screen right now. I'm very happy to be here and talk about how productivity patterns have shifted with the initiation of the modern monsoons. Happy to see a lot of the culprits here as well, past and present and possibly future. And I want to start with this notion that when we talk about monsoons, what most people have in mind is rainfall. However, monsoons are not just rain, they're also the wind. And both of these have a major impact on primary productivity in the ocean. This is a map showing the distribution of mesotrophic conditions in the Indian Ocean, and you can see quite clearly these very bright spots in the northern Indian Ocean. On one side in the Bay of Bengal, where runoff brings a lot of nutrients and supports a very high productivity level, and on the other side in the Arabian Sea, where we have upwelling. And both of these nutrient sources sustain a lot of productivity, a lot of remineralization, and as a subsequent effect, a lot of use of oxygen in the water column, which forms one of the largest oxygen minimum zone or oxygen depleted zone that we have in the oceans. But why did I bring up the wind? What does wind have to do with marine productivity? When organic matter sinks and remineralizes, it doesn't just release its carbon, it also releases back the nutrients the original biology consumes. And so the deeper water mass becomes enriched in nutrients. Here are, for example, a nitrate and phosphate profile from the center of the Indian Ocean. And you can see that the surface is mostly in this purplish tone, completely depleted, whereas the deeper waters are in this bright red, indicating very high amount of nutrients. But these nutrients are not available to the surface because they're separated by the thermocline. This is where wind comes in. if we have a very strong wind going parallel to shore, it displaces a large amount of water. As it displaces this water, the continuum function of water must remain. So water from deeper parts of the water column upwell up and bring with them their nutrients. And that provides a source of key nutrients to sustain a very large ecosystem. And there is very few wind systems as powerful as the monsoonal winds. And as we can see on this map of velocities, this results in these very strong jet systems and vertical movement along the Eastern African shelf and the Arabian coast, which we call sometimes the Finlander jets. And they sustain this very strong upwelling system. So productivity is driven by nutrients, nutrient is driven by upwelling in this area, and upwelling is driven by wind. But that's climate, and climate, as we are very acutely aware right now, is not something that's not stationary. Climate is changing, and to really understand how the coupling of the system may alter in the future, we need to understand where it's coming from and what controlling parameters are at play. And in this talk, I'm going to be talking mostly about two sites, site U1468 in the Maldives and site 722 in the Arabian Sea. And I want to use these sites to try and tell the story of how the modern oxygen minimum zone came to be, how it interacts, and how it interfaces with different types of productivity in the Indian Ocean. So let's start in the Maldives. Site U468 is situated in the inner sea on the slope of the ancient Cordova platform. And it's a very fortuitous location for us because it is, on one hand, close enough to the platform, it allows us to trace what's going on with neritic productivity. But on the other hand, it is far enough that we can also see what's going on with pelagic productivity. So here are two productivity proxies, and I'm going to go to what's going on in each of them in a second. Strontium calcium and silicon iron. And you can see there's a bunch of wiggles in there, but no long-term trend. And these wiggles are bisected by these vertical lines. These vertical lines are sequence boundaries that were originally delineated on the seismics, and then when it was drilled by Expedition 359, we were able to also delineate them and find them on the core. And these sequence boundaries delineate when sea level is low. And it's very interesting that these geochemical proxies are nicely bisected by the seismic elements. So I want to zoom into one of these cycles defined by these sequence boundaries. So we're looking now at a close-up between a sequence boundary PS7, which is around 15.6 million years, and PS8, which is 15 million years. And going from top to bottom, the strontium calcium traces the ratio between neritic, which is rich in high strontium aragonite, and pelagic, which is richer in low magnesium calcite. And we can see that in between the sequence boundary, when sea level is high, there's more export of high strontium aragonite, which is to be expected because the platform is flooded and we have more production area. And when we get close to the sequence boundaries, it drops as that productivity diminishes. So this traces sea level, which is primarily orbitally controlled during this part of the Miocene. But the flip side of it is the silicon iron ratio. which is the ratio between biogenic and lithogenic silica. And during high sea level, we see that we get more lithogenic silica, whereas during low sea level, we're seeing more of the biogenic silica. So there is a shift between the biogenic production, which is probably more pelagic, and the lithogenic supply, which corresponds with the high sea level and possibly provides key nutrients that are being supplied by the dust. And if I take the strontium data and try to compare that back to the sea level, well, it corresponds quite nicely to the oxygen in a statistically significant way. We see this nice linearization with one outlier, which is not too bad. But we don't really see any correspondence with carbon. And that is because carbon has a lot of controlling parameters, but also because we are going through this big hump in the carbon isotope during the Miocene. So when I sat down and I looked at the other proxies and other productivity indices that we had, trying to find something that was also corresponding very well to what's going on with the carbon, one of the things that popped to me was the manganese, which corresponds also better to the oxygen and to the carbon. And if we plot it up to depth, you can see that it starts to generate a shape that is very similar to the shape of the carbon isotopes. But now you would ask yourself, well, what does manganese actually means? I mean, it's an important micronutrient, it plays a role in photosynthesis, but how does that relate to its flux to the sediment? And for that, we go to a mechanism that's called manganese redirection. And in the Indian Ocean, this was first pointed by Jerry Dickens back in the 90s with Owen. And the idea is basically like this. Manganese in an oxidized environment is solid. It's insoluble in water. It is supplied from terrestrial sources as well as reoxidation of biologically bounded manganese. It goes into particulate form, and that particulate form goes into the sediment. But what if we don't have oxidized conditions? What if we have oxygen depleted conditions? Well, in that case, that manganese is not going to get transformed into its plus form mode, or if it is, it might get reduced to its plus 2 mode, and then it's water soluble, and it can be redirected and diffused and advected outwards, leading to a much lower flux of manganese to the sediment. And this is not just a hypothetical model. If we look at this really beautiful transect of manganese concentration, dissolved manganese concentration across the Indian Ocean, we can see this very strong bright red point in the north Arabian Sea, where the OMZ is, where a lot of manganese gets remobilized and retained in the water column. So let's go back to this manganese plot. And now we go back to our monsoon. Based on multiple proxy sets, we think right now that the modern mode of the monsoons, the more intensive monsoons, start around 13 million years ago. And we see that past 13 million years, manganese content is very low and it's quite stable. But if we take those levels and we take them back before the initiation of monsoons, we can see that at some point, we start getting values dipping into that band. Maybe short-lived expansion of the OMZ, stronger periods of monsoon before we get the stable modern monsoon. And we also see this trend of manganese depletion, which, kind of looks like the carbon isotope, but there's more to it because over this trend between 22 and 11, something really dramatic is happening in the Indian Ocean and in the oceanic system in general. And that one is driven by tectonics. When we start this time series, we still have connectivity between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. We have a low latitudinal certain global current. By the end of it, that's gone, and a lot of this heat that would leak out of the Indian Ocean gets bottled in the Arabian Sea. And not only that, it also shifts the way and intensity of the currents. And on top of it, also how we mobilize fleets. And Antakari Sar was very kind to provide me with some model simulations of that. And we can see on the right side, a model output of oxygen concentration in the top 600 meters with an open gateway, and on the left side with a closed gateway. And you can quite clearly see that having an open or closed gateway has dramatic effect for oxygen concentrations in the subsurface waters. So understanding this connectivity becomes quite important if we want to contextualize the interactions between the monsoons and the upwelling and productivity. So we need to delineate that and get some control of what's going on and when. And for that, we need to fingerprint the water column. We need to fingerprint specifically the surface waters. And we want to get that somewhere where we are not contaminated by the signal coming from terrestrial sources. So the ideal place for that is isolated carbonate platform, which are shallow, far from continents, mostly carbonate. And we have that in site Q468 for the Indian Ocean side. And for the Mediterranean side, went to Malta and collected samples there. And this plot composites all of what we know, so all the data we have for neodymium isotope, which is the tool that we select for the fingerprinting. The top line gives us the surface water in the Maldives, our Indian Ocean end member. And although there's like a little bit of shakiness in the late Oligocene, early Miocene, it's mostly flattened out at around -8, which is nice because that's more or less where it is now. There was already one published record from the Mascarenhas Plateau from Gurlan in intermediate waters, a little bit more radiogenic, but also quite stable. And there was some data published from northern Italy, but that was on a continental margin, and it has a whole bunch of other components that are adding to it. It's not as clean. But for Malta, well, that's a quite nice record with two major steps. One going from beginning very radiogenic in late Oligocene, early Miocene, dropping down to around -8, and then dropping down to around -11. But wait, -8 is the value in the Indian Ocean. Why is it so radiogenic to begin with? Shouldn't it be closer to what the Indian Ocean is bringing in? Let me make it even stranger. Here's a conceptual box model of the Mediterranean now. It's getting most of its water from the Atlantic, loses some of it to evaporation, so there's more water coming in than water coming out, and then gets a bit of water from freshwater input and exchange it with the Black Sea, which is very, very radiogenic. When you sum up the fluxes, you end up with an epsilon neodymium of about -6.6, which happens to be the value in the East Mediterranean. If I take the fluxes that were modeled by Elbad Navera, and I put those in with our end member source, with our end member composition, we get in the Mediterranean should be around minus 8.2. And that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing a much more radiogenic signal in the early Miocene, where we start getting these various indicators for the decoupling. And only then it goes down to this minus 8 value before going down to, again, in the cerebellium. What's going on? Where is the signal coming from? And for that, we need to put the proxies aside for a second and go look at the geology and the maps. Most of this connectivity, all of its disconnectivity, probably, unless there's an opening in the Red Sea, which we're not really sure about, is running through this Mesopotamian seaway, this Mesopotamian gateway, which is a very narrow sea, and at some periods, possibly also a very shallow sea. And that little seaway is surrounded by alkaline volcanism, which is very radiogenic. So with that in our mind, we can do some modeling. We can make some assumptions about reasonable erosion rate. And if we add that on this little gateway, we can basically fingerprint the gateway waters which are going to be very radiogenic. So the more water coming from the Indian Ocean, actually, through this gateway, the more they get fingerprinted by it, and the more radiogenic the neodymium is going to be. So where we start with a flux of maybe 22 severe drops coming in through this seaway, that's where we are in the earliest Miocene, until we hit 20 million years. And when we hit 20 million years, we see this big drop to around minus 8. And that, assuming that weathering rate has not changed, and we don't have any indication for big climatic shift at that point, well, that would be a loss of about 90% of the flux of water coming from the Indian Ocean into the Mediterranean. And the residual drop, that's the shift to Atlantic Valley, loss of connectivity. So we can delineate all of this into 3 main periods. An open gateway until 20 million years, then a restricted gateway, maybe with ephemeral connections, between 20 and around 13, followed by a closed connection. Since I did this work, some more data from the Deep Basin by Torsten and Steinberg came out, suggesting that deep water connection might have been lost earlier, somewhere between 21 and 24 million years. So this is where our current scheme for connectivity is. Razormit recently proposed the term Mesopotamian restriction stage, which I like, and I'm using it. So we have MRS0, that's the loss of deep water between 24 and 21. MRS1, the loss of most of the surface water exchange, that's between 20 and 19, mostly around 20. And then MRS2 between 14 and 13, and that's the final termination of connectivity. If we put this on the oxygen isotope curve, you would clearly see that MRS2 also falls with the Miocene climatic transition, and we know sea level drops, so it might not have been a tectonic shift that terminated it, but possibly a positive feedback between dropping sea level, reducing connectivity, pulling until we get to a point where no water could be exchanged on that surface anymore. So that's our framework. And naturally, this decoupling did a real number on the Mediterranean and completely shifted the way it was functioning. But that's not a talk for today, and for somewhere else. But on the other side of this connection, back in the Indian Ocean, if we go and take these 3 periods of connectivity and we put them on this manganese plot, we can see quite nicely that this short-lived OMZ period only begin when we have the restricted connectivity. I am currently hesitantly saying that this is probably interacting with sea level and cooling. We're doing some playing around with orbital parameters and modeling to test that. So watch this space, more will come. But I want to think about this trend that we're seeing in the end. We're seeing this ongoing depletion. We're saying, okay, this is due to expansion of the OMZ, but if we look at the modern map, site 1468 is not where the oxygen minimum zone is. This would mean maybe stronger upwelling in Monsoon and a much more expanded OMZ. We'll get to that later. But we're in the modern OMZ census strict 2. And to understand how that evolved and how that interacted with the winds and productivity, we need to go into the OMZ itself. And for that, I want to take you to site 722. It's an ODP site, so recovery is not as nice as we would like. But even with the spotty recovery, just visually, going from the older stuff on the left to the younger stuff on the right, there is a very clear shift, and it's a phases shift as well. If around 15 million years when we start the record, we are in this white, pristine, coccolith and foraminiferal dominated chalk. By the time we get to around 11 million years, we are in this brown, organic, rich diatomite-like material. That's a very big shift that goes in there. So let's start with the geochemical process. Manganese shows quite what we're seeing in the Maldives. We're seeing this depletion between 15 and 13, and then flattens out. And Zhao did some wonderful Tex 86 calorimetry on this site. So we're also seeing two periods of cooling. One at 13, that's more probably with the initiation of the modern monsoon, and another one at 11, which is very interesting. Because if we look at the other parameters at this site, the nitrogen isotope indicative of denitrification and the total organic carbon, those kick in at around 11. Now the cooling is not probably due to the winds, but rather has to do with the upwelling itself, because the waters that are being upwelled are cooler, deeper waters. So as a larger fraction of them comes to the surface water temperature is going to go down. But so far, these are geochemical proxies. It doesn't really tell us what's going on with productivity. For that, we need to actually look at the plankton. So I had Gerald Dauer and forced him to sit on the microscope for many, many hours and count the nanofossil, and we did assemblage work on that. And the assemblages that came out were very interesting because we found these low productivity assemblages, intermediate productivity assemblages, and high productivity assemblages. And he also had one of his students look at the planktonic foraminifera so we can pair those. But we can take these assemblages where the warmer colors are higher productivity and the more purplish colors are low productivity, and we can put them on our proxy data. And hey, look at that. We can clearly see that we're going from these lower productivity to these higher productivity assemblages, more or less in conjunction to what we're seeing in the proxy data. So we delineated this into 4 main periods. And what I want to do now is basically walk you through what we think is going on with the plankton. How does that interact with the largest oceanic system? And what does this tell us in some places about nutrients and the monsoons? And let's start at first, in the beginning, where we start off with, this is the period where we're seeing manganese depletion. This is the period where we're seeing the initial cooling. And then manganese depletion, again, is completely comparable to what we were seeing in the Maldives. So this is the period where we're losing the connectivity with the Mediterranean. And that's important because that means that we're losing Tethyan intermediate waters coming out from the Mediterranean and transforming it into the Red Sea, Persian Gulf waters. But that still means that we have dominantly a local intermediate water mass. And even when the monsoons are kicking in and becomes more intensifying, the Greenland jets are upwelling water. They're upwelling local water, which are just recycling local nutrients. So productivity is still limited. But then we get to the second stage, and diatoms start to come in. And with diatoms, we also see expansion of mixed layer taxa in the planktonic foraminifera, and increase in total organic carbon. So the system is starting to gear up. And this gearing up probably corresponds to more intense monsoons, stronger Greenlanders, but not only that. This is one side of a very long story. The other side of that is in Antarctica, which is being glaciated at this period. As the ice sheet expands and the latitudinal gradient increases, that supports intensification of the monsoon, but also shifts the way the nutrient conveyor works with, and the way nutrients get rejuvenated in the Southern Ocean. Those get supplied into intermediate waters and conveyed all the way north and provide us with extra nutrients that allow us to rig up the system to a higher state. And then next stage, we're seeing these large reticulofenestrates expanding, a lot more of this mixed layer taxa in the planktonic foraminifera, and also more upwelling taxa in the planktonic foraminifera. Not only that, we're seeing nitrogen isotope moving upwards, indicating that we are shifting to denitrification. And the text 86 inform us that the water is getting cooler, so it's more upwelling. But it's not so simple, because these large reticulofenestrates, well, if we look at experiments done on their modern equivalent, well, they're getting very big when they're nutrient limited and they grow very slow. And not only that, this period that we're seeing like this intensification of upwelling, it's where we have the highest abundance of discoesters, which we usually interpret to be oligotrophic. but it's also the period where we have the most amount of diatoms, which are definitely not oligotrophic. So there's a bit of a conundrum about what's going on here, or maybe not. So I want to come back to this map I started with. This map shows the distribution of mesotrophic conditions. So nutrient elevated, high productivity, high chlorophyll level, not extreme, but high. But one thing I didn't point out earlier was that the scale is logarithmic. So even where we're seeing these nice, bright green colors, that's just 10% of the time. And this is with a winter monsoon and a summer monsoon. But we know in between them, trophic level goes down. So what if in this period, with the expansion of the glaciation of Antarctica, a stronger latitudinal gradient, a lot of nutrients conveyed, we have also stronger seasonality. And specifically, we have a stronger summer monsoon. And with this stronger summer monsoon, that allows us to have a period of lull where nutrient level can come down again. Even the mixing that we get in winter is not as intense as what we're getting from the upwelling, allowing us to have this very seesaw condition between more oligotrophic and more mesotrophic, even eutrophic, maybe, we don't know. And then you would go like, yeah, but how are we getting both of them at the same time? And that's the thing, we're not getting both of them at the same time. We're looking at taphonomic assemblages, and taphonomic assemblages fundamentally integrate and time average things that are below our resolution. So if we get both of these together, it doesn't mean they're necessarily co-inhabiting, they're just alternating in the frequency that is much higher than our sampling resolution. So at 11 to 8.8 million years, we do see an apex. And this apex corresponds to a very strong summer monsoon, probably. And then, towards the end of the record, well, we lose the large reticular finasteride, diversity crashes, total abundances crash, diatom crash. And you're like, what? But shouldn't this like get stronger? No, because it's not just getting the nutrients, it's also getting the right nutrients. And if we see, for example, depletion in the silica stock through this time, if the winter monsoon shifts the way these nutrients are being distributed, as these different parameters come into play, they change the plankton population and they shift the way the modes the system works. We still don't have a most perfect understanding of what exactly is going on in this period, but it's a very interesting period. But these are two data points, and they're in the Northwest Indian Ocean. And if we just look at this manganese record in 722 and 1468, they're already telling us some of the story, but most of the story of the Northwest Indian Ocean. And if we look at the manganese record going further up into the Pliocene and the Pleistocene, we see manganese level in the Maldives are going up again. So there are exchanges. There is a shift in the way the system works. When we start in the late Oligocene to early Miocene, we probably have minimal oxygen minimum zone, and it's probably very close to the shores where the winds are infecting it. But as connectivity between the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean diminishes, and the water mass structure shifts and reorients, we start seeing this metastable, unstable oxygen minimum zone expanding for a period, and then maybe collapsing again, maybe establishing again, until we get to around 30 million years, when we see this expansion of ice in Antarctica, increase in latitudinal gradient, intensification of the monsoon into our modern monsoon system. And then after a ramp up, we're getting a stable, modern oxygen minimum zone. This is the story for the Northwest Indian Ocean. But we don't want just to understand how this system interacts and behaves in the Northwest Indian Ocean. We understand the entire Indian Ocean. So we can stack up data from other sites. And when we do that, we get a more complicated picture. This depletion around 15 million years, we can see that in a Mascarein, and we can possibly even see it all the way to Broken Ridge at the same time, which is kind of weird. And we do see high productivity oxygen depleted phases spanning the entire Indian Ocean for this time. And on the 90th ridge, we see manganese depletion in the late Miocene kicking in more or less at the same time when diatoms start showing up at 707. And we're seeing other high productivity phases at site 710 and 709. So we end up with another period of high productivity, which is different. It's not the same as the first one. And we've delineated these as the late Miocene biogenic bloom and the middle Miocene carbonate crash. These are part of larger processes. But if they're indeed linked to expanded OMZ, well, these are probably periods where we're seeing very significant monsoonal activity, and those are paired with nutrient conveyance across the entirety of the Indian Ocean. So, to wrap up, intra and cross-hemispherical transit of heat and water were imperative in the development of the current system of monsoonal upwelling in the Western Indian Ocean. Restriction of the low-latitude circumglobal current allowed for intensification of upwelling in the northwestern Indian Ocean, and intensification of the monsoon in the middle and late Miocene led to stronger and wide-reaching oxygen minimum zone expansion across the Indian Ocean as a whole. This work has been going on for several years now with many, many collaborators. Most of them are listed here. But of these, I feel obliged to note our dear departed friend Dick Kroon, who very much set me on this course, and in his footstep I'm following here, and he's very, very missed. And a shameless self-plug, as I am currently still looking for a permanent position, and I'm happy to use this platform to do some more promotion on that. And with that, I have said enough. Thank you for your attentions. Question, discussion?
Thank you so much, Or. This is a very, very complex picture of the monsoon and the Indian Ocean. I was wondering when you were talking how circularity plays into defining the modern monsoon and the proxies to define it, given your work.
How does what? I missed a word.
The circularity.
Circularity.
Your work shows that proxies used in defining the start of the monsoon might be proxies for starting the OMZ, not proxies for precipitation or wind.
Yeah.
Changes our picture of that.
Yeah, I mean, this has been an ongoing debate, and I think Peter and I have discussed this at one point or another, because we have to ask ourselves a question when we talk about the initiation of the monsoons. Are we talking about the rain or the wind? Are they two different things, or are they one thing? And yeah, they're definitely. I would say that definitely a lot of the proxies we have been using are proxies for the upwelling, and then derive that upwelling is the wind, and deriving that the wind is the rain.
Yeah. And what you show here, at least to me, if I'm correct, is that the connection with Mediterranean really is the setting factor of what's happening in that part of the world.
I think connectivity is imperative, and it's not just the Mediterranean, because we also have variation in the Indonesian fruit flu about the same time. And as we bisect the Indian Ocean and shift the way that water is being circulated, that shifts a lot of the way the climate system works. Because once you, and because it's a paired system, it works in a lot of very interesting ways. Because once we stop putting the Tethyan intermediate waters in the Indian Ocean, it has to go somewhere else. So it goes into the Atlantic and becomes Mediterranean outflow waters, which intensifies the AMOC in turn. But at the same time, when we lose the Tethyan intermediate waters, and then there's modeling work that's been done on that, that actually allows the ACC to speed up. So losing that connection actually does a lot of things to the climate system that increase the latitudinal gradient, which in turn can intensify the monsoon.
So in other words, everything everywhere all at once.
Yes.
Okay. So please ask your questions. You can send them to me, or you can address them directly to Or.
Ray, you have a question?
Hi, Jorn. Nice to see you. Hope you are doing well. And it was a very, very interesting discussion, and you tried to include quite a lot of things in this. This final thing you've been mentioning about once you close the gateway into the Mediterranean and you have these waters in the Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean, and they're affecting the ACC. How confirmed is it? I know there is modeling work which suggests this, but I think that's been quite a few years now from those models of De La Fara, and there was another one which slips my mind. Sorry?
Hamon.
Yes, exactly that one. Has this been maybe reconfirmed, or is there work going on to really sort of settle this this idea out? Because it's quite a big thing. You see how important the Mediterranean waters are for the climate system.
I don't know. That's more in the modeling space, which as someone who's working on sediment and proxies, I'm tangential to. I would be very interested to see if this could be revisited with more modern models with higher resolution grid size. But I have not seen too much work in that space. I think definitely if anybody watches this on YouTube later or here and finds that interesting, please, this is our call. We want more modeling work on this.
Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else?
I'm sure you will receive questions. As I said, the stronger audiences after the fact, unfortunately, but that's where we live now. We used to have a bigger audience during pandemic, but everybody had something else to do then. So
hopefully people will follow up. Hi, Stephen.
Yeah, hello all. Stefan Steinke from Charmin University.
Yes.
I totally agree, right, with when looking on your ODB site 722B site, this shift in manganese, aluminium, for example, right, the initiation of the oxygen minimum soon and things like that, so that we have there a shift between 14 and 15 million years, right? That is also in good agreement with our rainfall reconstruction from the Eastern Arabian Sea.
Yes.
That looks really nice, right? But my question now is, right, because I just came up with a study of Yao et al. Just published in Nature Communications, right? And they are telling a weakening of the South Asian summer monsoon since 12 million years ago. Are you aware of this study, right? And I was really surprised seeing this study. I've seen also, I agree with your studies, right, that we are establishing the modern monsoon somewhere around 14, 15 million years ago, right? But now this study came out, right, just recently.
I have
and
not.
They're telling us that there is a weakening of the South Asian summer monsoon.
I have not read that one yet. It's on my read list, which is very long. But I'm not actually that surprised somebody argues that, because if you look at some of the proxy data, there seems to be this in the Arabian Sea, there's this peak between 11 and 8.8, and then things go a bit to a different direction. Does that mean that monsoons are weakening? I don't think so. I think there might be again an issue of conflicting different proxies for things that are 1 or 2 steps removed. But I need to look at that paper and actually read it. I don't think we are seeing evidence of diminishing intensity when we look at things that are further apart, further away. Like when we look at data in the Maldives, we don't see we don't see that until the Pleistocene, and even then, I'm not even sure that that's really what's happening there. We're working on that, and there's a proposal that I put into to get into this in more detail. I don't know yet. I want to see, I want to go and take 722 and 731 and actually look at the late Miocene to Pleistocene record at some point and look at those proxies in more detail, because I don't think it's a straightforward picture. But I also have to, ask from a, Earth reconstruction perspective, and this is a question to the community more and me thinking out loud more than having a clear idea at this point. How are we weakening the monsoons if, as we're going from the late Miocene onwards, the overall trend is cooling, the latitudinal gradient is intensifying? What would be the underlying mechanism that would change the pressure fronts, where the high and low systems are, that would result in a weaker monsoon? Because the way I'm looking at this time, and maybe by next month I'll change my mind, but from my perspective at this time, I would think they would intensify rather than weaken.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, difficult to answer, right? Yeah.
And
what is the effect? Yeah, what is the effect on ice sheets in Antarctica about that, right?
Yeah, it's
Yao et al. Argue, okay, it's because of the ice sheet growth, right? That decreases or weakens the Asian summer monsoon. I would argue, the opposite, right?
Yeah.
More ice stronger monsoon, right?
Yes, that's where I'm standing right now.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's not just the ice. We also need to consider the interaction with the Himalayas and weathering, and what's going on with albedo. And of course, we have one other component in this entire story, which we was not mentioned so far, and that's Northern Hemisphere glaciation, which I don't know how that interacts with the rest of this. For in the Indian Ocean space, we kind of ignore that because we don't have high latitude a component, but it's there. It's affecting heat export across the Atlantic. I don't think we can completely ignore it, but that's for someone else down the line. I know some people are working on it. I'm looking forward to what they're going to come up with.
These are really good questions that we asked since 30 years ago. It seems that the picture is getting more complex before becoming simpler.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're about to do for a revolution.
Well,
It's a nice summary, Livio. So sorry, I have to leave. I have another meeting. So
thank you for your questions, Stephen.
Thank you very much. And I was very happy to host you, and it was a very, very thinking, made me think a lot about what it needs to be done, and thought-provoking. And thank you very much again.
Thank you for having me, and hopefully we're gonna get some nice views on YouTube.
Okay. Bye-bye.
I just wanted to say thanks to both of you. I haven't seen either one of you in a while.
Hey, Jerry. and whose fault is that?
See you everybody next week.
Bye.